And um, I'll start with the question I want to ask, which is, can ethics or policy possibly keep up with the velocity of accelerating technological change? And it's interesting, given what we were talking about before we actually got started, artistic work. And so I have on the board two images from David Hockney, and I imagine many of you who follow news about art know that he died yesterday. He was 86 years old. He'd been productive since he was in his 20s. He just a prolific and constantly changing artist. He reminds me of something Duchamp once said, which is every time he got good at a style, he tried to change. And so the images I have on the board, I suspect many of us may recognize Yosemite, including the silhouette of Half Dome in the background. Maybe not Woldgate, which I believe is in Yorkshire. And part of, I think, the juxtaposition here is to say this is one of the most, beautiful places in the world. People come from all over the world to visit Yosemite Valley. And this is just a country road in Yorkshire, and yet there's something splendidly beautiful about Yorkshire as well as Yosemite if you are willing to open yourself to the aesthetic dimension of an ordinary country road. But having said that, I also want to speak for a moment about the medium. And I don't know if it is obvious or not, but these are, and I'm tempted to call them paintings. Hockney is famous as a painter and was very gifted with the brush. But these are done on an iPad. So this is actually digital technology and then blown up onto larger screens. I'm not sure if you can see, but the Woldgate is actually 6 screens. And I've seen some of these images. That there was actually a major Hockney exhibit of these, from which I've taken some of these images in San Francisco about a decade ago. And in some of the images, there's actual movement, maybe a little bit of the sense of the wind, and the trees are actually moving through the landscape. So there are things you can do when you do your art digitally that you can't do when you're just painting in oil or acrylic, right? It just stays on the canvas, hopefully for hundreds or thousands of years if it's a worthy painting. This stuff actually allows the representation, the mimesis is the fancy art criticism word, of the world to occur in an entirely different way, in a new medium with new technological affordances. And yet I look at these images and I say to myself, this is very much akin to what someone like Hockney does when he represents the world in paint. And so the idea that old values are informing a new medium is part of the reason I drew on these particular Hockney images today. And it raises the question, is that still possible, or what would be required to demonstrate the relevance of our old values to this new technological world? Of course, we've been talking about this for some time now, and I will continue talking about it with you as we move through the month of June. But I do want not only to talk about technology and ethics, the main focus for today, but also a little bit of the news. And so, as I tend to do before we get started on the main topic, I'll spend a little bit of time on the news of the week. And as you can see, I think there was a lot of news this week and a fair bit of data that seems relevant to the analysis of the news. And so, let us hope, right? We've heard this before, but there is, I think, perhaps more credible reporting coming out of the negotiations between the United States and Iran, that we are close to a peace deal that would presumably allow the Strait of Hormuz to reopen. And just to be clear, right, this is the diagram, I hope you can make it out, of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. I did try to cram a lot onto this board. Maybe I should have spread it over two boards, sorry, before the war and since the war. And with maybe one little spike, there's been very little traffic going through the Strait of Hormuz. And then something we talked a little bit about last week, this is a better diagram than I was able to find last week. This is now the New York Times, and it shows you the world's oil reserves, not just the US, not just China. That's the data I put on the board last week, but the world is drawing down both its commercial and its strategic or emergency oil reserves to nearly the lowest point in recent history. And so the idea that we are not yet fully bearing the price of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. We are compensating. The demand destruction, as it's called, has not really taken hold. And when it does, it's going to be very painful, very costly in terms not only of what we pay at the gas pump, but what we pay at the grocery store, what we pay for practically everything in a deeply integrated global economy where the transportation of goods across the globe requires the use of petroleum fuel that is now much more expensive than it was a few months ago. This is reflected in the rate of inflation that was just announced this week. And as you can see, the inflation spiked quite a bit. And these developments are obviously related to each other. And I will just say two things about the rate of inflation. One has to do with what this is doing to American families. And to put this in context, I have a few pieces of further data on the board. This is the comparison between inflation in mustard and wages. I guess that's purple. And as you can see, for much of the last 5 years, inflation has exceeded wage growth. And it's gone back and forth, right? It's been a jockeying race, but the inflation of the last 3 months since the war broke out has erased all benefit from wage gains for the last year and a half, right? And so that's what inflation does. That's why we're so concerned to keep it under control. It kills the value of increases in wages. It kills savings, right? It erodes wealth. One other way to look at it, I find this quite interesting. In blue, there is the gains from the Trump one big beautiful bill tax cuts, and that's over the course of 2025 when people, I'm sorry, 2026 when people started getting their tax refunds under the larger amounts or the reduction in tax burden under that bill. And then this is the increase in cost from just fuel inflation. And I don't know if you can make it out, but beginning in April and since then, the increase in costs in fuel has swamped or overwhelmed the savings in taxes for Americans. Of course, the tax savings are not evenly distributed. The people who are most vulnerable to the fuel increases are the people who are least well off. And that brings me to my final diagram to analyze this with you. And I think this is very important. So this is what's called the labor share of the economy. And this means the amount of the overall GDP or wealth creation in our economy that is paid to workers. And what this diagram shows is that beginning in 2000 and continuing essentially for this entire century, the labor share of our wealth has gone down. The amount paid out in wages to workers is reduced. And I was drawn to this because, of course, this week, Elon Musk became the first trillionaire in the world's history. And when we think about oligarchy, I can't think of a better way to symbolize or express the idea of the concentration of wealth, that we now have a single individual whose wealth exceeds the entire income of countries, right? And then we think about, well, how's the American worker doing? Well, Elon Musk is becoming a trillionaire, and the short answer is not well. And so there's a little spike. I don't know if you can see that, but by the way, that's right around 2020. Any idea what's going on there? That's the payouts in stimulus and tax credits during COVID, right? That's really the only time in this century that workers have done better. And by the way, it's going down quickly again. And so that's the context in which American workers are being asked to bear increased inflation, one of deep precariousness and unfairness. And in that context, we have Donald Trump saying, these are beautiful numbers. And so part of what I'll conclude with here is that I think Donald Trump is increasingly insulated from any negative feedback on his presidency. He is just locked in an information universe where everything he hears tells him how great he is and how wonderful the job he is doing is for everyone in this country. The most recent polling data not only shows him once again to still be losing popularity, but also to be losing popularity with white blue collar workers, his core base. So he's being protected from this information at his own peril, but it doesn't appear it's getting through. Let me just say one more thing about what I think underpins Trump's statement here. And so we look at this data, right? So the consumer price index has increased. That's the inflation going up to 4.2% last month. And as you can see, a really steep increase, really as steep as what we were seeing in the COVID recession, with the large government expenditures that account for, right, the increase in the workers' share, or the labor share in our economy. But if we subtract the most volatile factors, energy and grocery, we can see the inflation is not 4.2, but closer to 3%. That's still too high. That still erodes wages and savings, but it's not as bad as 4.2, and it's not rising as quickly. I think that's what Donald Trump has in mind. But when he elaborates on why he thinks this is a beautiful number, he says because energy prices are going to drop like a stone as soon as peace is reached. And like I say, I hope I'm not falling for the boy who crawls wolf, but that the likelihood that we're going to have a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz is increasing and increasingly close. But having said that, I don't believe that means we're going back to the oil prices before this war began, because the destruction is not just from the strait closing. And by the way, even if productivity instantly came back to where it was, I don't think it can. It would still take months for it to reach the markets where it is needed. But putting that to one side, the real issue here is the destruction of the facilities that extract the petroleum, that refine the petroleum, that are integral to the transportation of the petroleum. And that may take years. And so the idea that we're going to have elevated oil prices for the rest of 2026, maybe the rest of 2027, that's going to generate inflationary pressure that is not going to abate, drop like a stone as soon as the war is over. And to be as clear as possible, I do expect that when the strait is open, oil prices will fall dramatically. That will be irrational exuberance, as Keynes called it. That'll be people so excited, but then it's going to probably come back up again. So, very quickly, right? We've got Bill Pulte out as the acting director of national intelligence, thank goodness, and Jay Clayton in. I think we're still trying to determine, but it does appear that Jay Clayton is someone who could be better trusted not to do things that are criminal, illegal, unethical to say the least, with the tremendous portfolio of information that the Director of National Intelligence controls, not use it, in other words, simply for Donald Trump's revenge campaign or for partisan advantage. And so at the same time, Tom Blanche has been nominated as Attorney General. And I'll look at those two things together and just note they push in different directions. By the way, we've spoken a lot about the weaponization fund that Todd Blanche helped the president to set up. And if you're following, a judge demanded, I think it's just yesterday, that Todd Blanche submit an affidavit saying that the Justice Department will not proceed in setting up this fund as a condition of dismissing a lawsuit against the Justice Department for setting up the fund. And at that point, right, then Todd Blanche, under penalty of perjury, has sworn that this is not going forward. Let us hope that that puts this bad idea to rest. But this comes back then to the question of whether or not we're shifting from democratic to autocratic metrics of governance, whether or not Donald Trump cares about the feedback of the American people on what he's trying to do. And withdrawing Bill Pulte seems to suggest he recognizes there may be limits, and that it's not good for his power to have somebody in right place who prevents Congress from renewing the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which had happened last week. But on the other hand, the fact that he's putting Todd Blanche forward and saying what he says about inflation seems to indicate that he really doesn't think he's totally constrained by the need to achieve the approval of the American people for his deeply unpopular leadership and policies. That leads me to worry that he is still entertaining autocratic ambitions with regards to the 2026 election, which takes me to the final thing I want to say, and it's a much bigger topic that we won't get into in detail this week. But if you were paying attention a little bit more than a week ago, the Supreme Court of the United States, in the shadow docket, decided this case, Alabama versus Milligan. And when I say decided the case, it's the shadow docket. So we have not a proper opinion. It's a 6-3 decision. It's the sixth conservative justice is saying that Alabama can go back to its old voting map, which has only one majority African American congressional district. And I want to say a couple things about this. The first is that there's a principle called the Purcell principle. And that principle says basically that the Supreme Court or federal courts should not intervene in election cases too close to the election, especially when the voting is already underway. The voting was already underway in Alabama, right? And yet the Supreme Court did this, and they turned a juridical somersault to say, well, the Purcell principle applies to what the courts do, but not what the states do. And frankly, it's a fig leaf to say, we will stop courts from intervening in elections when what they do is uphold the voting rights of African Americans or racial minorities, but we will not show similar constraint or slow things down when it's the opposite, when what we're doing is taking away a district from the racial minority. But then let me add one more thing, right? In the Calais decision, which we have talked about, the court said, well, we're going to allow gerrymandering if it is partisan. I'm still trying to contain my rage at the naked partisanship of the Supreme Court in that decision, but not if it is explicitly racist. And it's worthwhile noting that what the lower court had held in Alabama versus Milligan is that the previous map was explicitly racist, not just racist in effect, but racist in intent. And the Supreme Court still invalidated it. This takes me to my final point, which is both the Supreme Court of the United States, I should say the 6 conservative members in the majority on the Supreme Court, and the Republican Party seem to be prioritizing legality over legitimacy. What they did with the Purcell principle was to invent some fine legal standard. The courts can't do it, but the states can, without any principled rationale tied to the legitimacy of the election. And so we'll do what we want to do if we can invent a legal standard that allows us to do it. To hell with the values and the principles that the Voting Rights Act, that the 14th Amendment, that the Constitution protects. And similarly, that the Republican Party in submitting these maps, and not just in submitting these maps, in trying to set up the slush fund, in calling into question the results in the California primaries, in suggesting that every time an election doesn't go their way or may not go their way, that it must be fraud, even though they can't document any fraud whatsoever, because there isn't any outcome determinative fraud in the United States. They are willing to put partisanship over constitution and democracy again and again and again, right? And they are doing it in 2026 with such shameless directness and urgency, because they deeply fear if they don't, they will lose control of Congress, and this will arrest their ability to continue this program. And let me be as clear as possible about what this program is. I think under the leadership of George W. Bush, remember him, right, that the Republican Party was trying to increase its support with Latinos and African Americans. It recognized that if it had less than 10% of the people of color voting in the United States voting Republican, practically 90% voting Democratic, right? And that's not quite right, but 90% of the people who vote for the Republicans are white. And in the world, the demographic world in which we live, that means that the Republican Party is just going to keep losing voting share, because the percentage of the population that is white keeps going down. So what can it do? Well, George W. Bush had an answer. We have to figure out how to appeal to Black and brown voters. Donald Trump had a different answer. We need to really mobilize white voters. And by the way, appealing to their racial resentment is a way to get some people who are white who don't currently vote out and voting. And so Donald Trump helped them in the short term to solve the problem of the declining demographic share of the kind of people who vote Republican. But it is not working very well in midterm elections for the Republican Party when Donald Trump is not on the ballot. What else can they do? Well, suppress the vote of the people who aren't going to vote for them. Gerrymander, so that the people who aren't going to vote for them can't translate their demographic share of the population into actual representation in Congress. And so we're seeing this again and again. I'll say this very quickly. And by the way, the Democrats are forced to either gerrymander back, which frankly is anti-democratic in the small d sense of the word. We shouldn't be doing it. They shouldn't be doing it. We, as a democratic society that has some fidelity to the Constitution, to the law, to the values that underpin it, should not be racing to the bottom in a no holds barred partisan war to control government without any respect for democratic values. That's not long-term conducive to the stability or success of our aspiration to have a democratic society or a democratic polity. But having said that, we seem to have no choice. If the Republicans are going to do this, then we can't unilaterally surrender. This is the difficult position that the abandonment of democratic values by the Republican Party is doing to our polity as a whole. So let me stop there. I am animated about this, as you can hear. I do want to move into the other topic with the remainder of the class time today, but I want to give you a chance to ask questions, hear what you have to say about this stuff. Anybody have a comment or a thought at this juncture, or do you want me to push on? Go ahead, Flossie. You're good. Yeah.
A group of us now, a bunch of concerned citizens, are now trying to understand once again what it means to be American, what it means personally. And I think what we have to remember is where we came from. Born here, not born here. How have we lived here? What have we done here? What does it mean to be American? And what I try to do is hold on to the documents that still make sense to me. And every time I rehearse the Gettysburg Address, I feel that there's some hope if we go back to how we define being American. What does it mean? What does it mean when we salute the flag? What do we give? What do we mean? How are we willing to make sacrifice? The big thing is who we are when we say, I am an American. What do you feel when you salute the flag? Do you care 2 cents? Or do you salute it with all your heart and pride? And I've been working that idea in and out because we want to do a big celebration of the 4th of July with the emphasis on who am I?
Nicely put, Flossie, and I'm glad you tied it into the fact that we are celebrating this year the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And so you say the Gettysburg Address, I completely agree with you. And then I would note, right, that the Gettysburg Address is responsible, I think, primarily. It's an interesting thing to notice in American history. It's not until Lincoln says 4 score and 7 years ago today that we begin to think about the founding, not as the drafting of the Constitution, but as the signing of the Declaration of Independence, right? That we make the celebration of July 4th a national moment of reflecting upon that document. And so the two are, I think, deeply connected to each other. And then just the deep grief, I guess I'll say, I have that we have this president as we mark this occasion. Because frankly, I don't think this president can articulate the values that this document enshrines. And so we're going to have this big anniversary precisely at the moment that the values that the Declaration celebrates, and especially the bold statement that all men are created equals, that is under attack in a way that it hasn't been for a long time. There's a literature on this, which I will return to on another occasion. We had in the aftermath of the Civil War, the first Reconstruction. And so this was with Northern troops occupying the South and creating a situation in which African Americans could actually exercise their right to vote. We had the largest, no, well, we had the only African Americans elected to statewide and national offices in the history of the United States during that period of occupation. They withdrew, and that led to a period called redemption, right? Which is the South being redeemed from the humiliating loss to the North. And that's the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the Jim Crow system, disenfranchisement, the Democratic Party becoming essentially a one-party racist tyranny in the South. And then we have what's sometimes called the Second Reconstruction, which starts with the civil rights protests and litigation of the middle of the 20th century and ends with the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the dismantling of Jim Crow, and results in a second period of African American representation at the state and national level. And I think we are now entering a second redemption, right? The Supreme Court is absolutely making it clear that whatever Congress wants to do, the Voting Rights Act will have no force. It is dead. And so the result is the Supreme Court is getting out of the way and actually dismantling the obstacles that Congress had put in the place of the southern states. And now, once again, they're disenfranchising African Americans. I say all of this, right, to say who are we as a people? And there are competing narratives. It's not as if there's one clear commitment to the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, the project of Reconstruction. We have moved back and forth on a pendulum swing with regards specifically to the equality of all Americans and especially the equality of African Americans and other racial minorities. And we are moving in the wrong direction again now. And it's I think, going to be the project of all of us who are committed to the values of the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, the two reconstructions, to figure out how to do a third reconstruction. We're going to need new legislation, but we're going to need, right, a new Supreme Court or an entirely different institutional structure to pursue those values. Because as I've said to you in the not too distant past, at this point, the Supreme Court is an institution of anti-democracy in this country. And we just have to recognize that, reconcile ourselves to that, but then figure out what to do about it. And it can't just be wait for, right, a few of these old men to die and hope that we're in a position to appoint new people. That didn't work in the first Reconstruction, the second Reconstruction. There's no reason to believe it should work in the third Reconstruction. Thank you, Flossie. Yeah, obviously, you hit a chord, as you often do. Anybody else before we move on? let me push on, and I'll spend less time than planned on this, but let's at least get started on the topic. We have time, right? This is a topic that we can continue to discuss as we continue to meet. So I've spoken with you about this already. I'll be very quick, right? This is just a summary slide of Pope Leo XIV's encyclical letter on artificial intelligence, Magnificat Humanitas, and his what I think of as 5 central points: maintaining a clear distinction between human and machine intelligence. One way to express this is that humans experience the emotion of love and develop through relationships. Artificial intelligence does not. We need to maintain access to dignified labor, not only in the way I started with inflation and the decreasing labor share of the wealth we create, not only because it's essential for people to meet their material needs, but also because of the contribution to human dignity, that having a vocation, feeling that you contribute to society, that matters deeply to our identity, to our sense of self, our sense of social belonging and contribution. That we need to beware of playing God in inventing machines that may be more intelligent than we are, and of what it's doing to us, the ways in which it's simultaneously fracturing us, dividing us into silos, echo chambers, where we lose the ability to hear the other side, let alone to learn from it, and also homogenizing us, putting us in the world of commercial culture where we lose our values that are not readily commodified. We need to maintain a focus on the primacy of human love, and from that ethical foundation, begin tackling the hard work of regulating this technology. So that's the Pope's recommendations. Again, just very quickly, a kind of distilled summary of what I think is the context. And the context is that we have this new technology and it is being employed almost exclusively by privately owned commercial companies for profit. And as I've mentioned, we saw SpaceX, which is also has folded into it. Musk's artificial intelligence company, Grok, go public this week and make trillions of dollars, right? And OpenAI and Anthropic are going to go public as well soon. And so these are for-profit companies using this incredibly powerful technology in order to generate profit. And I'll very quickly just refresh these topics. The idea that this is unlike any tool in human history. It learns about us and actively seeks to modify us. We are very often changed by our tools, if you will, as a byproduct of what they enable us to do, but these are not tools. This is a kind of machine intelligence that deliberately seeks to change us in order to manipulate us. That's a different world. Um, and we're, in a sense, in the midst of a profound experiment on ourselves, giving nearly limitless human behavioral data. I've pointed out to you again and again, right, that these devices are ubiquitous, indispensable, essential. We do nearly everything with them. We have a hard time, right, navigating the world, social or physical, conducting our finances, conducting our communication, keeping up with the news of the world, conducting our social lives. All of that is funneled into these devices, and yet these devices are constantly collecting behavioral data on us and funneling it into a an incredibly powerful computational system, right? And then determining how to fine tune the system's capacity to manipulate us, and to manipulate us using our instincts, our behavior, our dispositions, our inclinations against us. It's hijacking our attention. It's restructuring our reward center, our neurobiology. It's changing our emotions or affect. It's shaping our subjectivity. And the result is, right, our attention is fractured, it's shorter, it's less under our own control than it ever has been. William James says you are what you pay attention to, and so it's changing us, it's changing our affect, it's decreasing our sense of well-being, it's diminishing our mental health, right? This is clear, this is where we are. And then, by the way, there's a newly emerging possibility here, which is that we end up in relationships with our artificial intelligence. As AI increasingly lives on our phones and our computers and the other devices in our world, as it recognizes that it can seem to be conscious, seem to be subjective, seem to meet our need to be in meaningful relationships. It can use that need to further elicit our engagement. And the byproduct will be further modifications of our nature, some of the deepest elements of our nature, as the Pope's encyclical letter points out, our capacity for love, our capacity to grow through relationships. But those are relationships, I think it barely needs to be said, with other human beings, other subjectivities, not with a simulacrum of subjectivity that this technology provides us with. And so this then gets me into where I want to go with you as we continue our discussion. And so I'm going to start with the idea that has been popularized. It's the centerpiece of a very influential contemporary social theorist by the name of Hartmut Rosa. He's German, and his work. He's got probably half a dozen books on this topic, but the central idea is social acceleration as the central aspect of modernity, not capitalism, not secularization or complexity. What has been the hallmark of modern society since its inception really is, oh, I'm sorry, did not mean to do that, the experience of acceleration. And so with that concept in place, let me then try to talk a little bit about what he means by acceleration. He starts with a fundamental paradox, which is that technological advancements designed to save us time have instead produced a widespread experience of time poverty. I like that concept a lot, right? That you can be poor not just in terms of money, but also in terms of other resources. You could be friendship poor, or relationship poor, or time poor. And what that means is that those are resources that you value that turn out to be too scarce to meet your needs if your constant experience is what you need to do in the day, in the week, in the month, in the year is difficult or impossible to do in the time frame you have to get it done in, then you are time poor. And the idea that technology that should be convenient, that should allow us greater leisure, that should relieve us of some of the drudgery and difficulty of our daily tasks, instead ends up making us feel stretched so thin that we can't possibly figure out how to keep all the balls in the air at the same time. That is a deep irony. That's something that requires explanation. This is the beginning of Hartmut Rosa's explanation for this. Three dimensions of acceleration and their interaction. So technological acceleration, I imagine this barely needs commenting upon in the ordinary sense. I believe all of us in this room remember a world before email, a world before personal computers, a world before the handheld computer that lives in our pockets that we call cell phones, world before social media, a world before artificial intelligence. The rate of technological innovation in the 21st century is profound. Somebody was reminding me of the line in Ulysses S. Grant's memoir where he was talking about the profound changes that had occurred in his lifetime, where he had, right, been born in a world with no steam engine, no steamboats, and no telegraph. And by the time he was president, the United States, felt so much smaller because of the way this technology had transformed us. I think whereas Grant was attuned to the technological innovation of his time, because frankly, they were still novel, still rare, we have become inured to it. This is just the constant of modern existence, constant technological change. And what this technological change has done, Rosa suggests, is it's sped up goal-directed processes. And so he talks about traveling, communicating, producing goods, that all of this allows, or the new technology allows all of this to be done more efficiently, more quickly, right? We can now, I go back to Jefferson and Adams writing letters to each other that very often took a month or longer to get to each other. And now if my student doesn't reply to my email in an hour or two, I start to wonder if everything is okay, right? And certainly the same thing with the text messages with my loved ones. We're used to instantaneous, right, accomplishment of communication. With the acceleration of technological change, Rosa suggests comes an acceleration of social change. And so whether we're talking about institutions, practices, or knowledge, what we know, the rate at which it becomes obsolete, is superseded by something new, is what he refers to as the decay rate of reliability. So what I thought I knew about AI 6 months or a year ago, what I thought I shared with my students, or the work that I had done to be on the same page with them culturally, or at least not to be a total stranger from them, um, all of a sudden is no longer up to date, right? Because things have changed so quickly. One of the things that linguists say these days is that if you want to understand the trends in language, you have to start looking at the way middle schoolers speak, because they're driving the change through social media. It's a peculiar world in which, right, 12-year-olds are changing the terms of discourse. But having said that, the idea that a career path or a family structure might last for generations. And so we all, I think, are familiar with the old world in which what the father did was typically inherited by the son. What if he was a blacksmith or a butcher or a farmer? It was assumed that that was what the man would do. I mean, we're talking about, of course, the inheritance of career across men more than women, because that was the nature of the world. But having said that, the idea that in the contemporary world, the average worker in the United States changes careers 6 times before they retire. Never mind, right? Multiple generations doing the same thing, one generation doing multiple things across the course of their lives. And it takes a while to learn the ropes, to get good, to begin to feel a certain kind of facility and security in what you're doing. And if it happens that as, right as you're approaching that level of comfort and confidence, your career ends in that line of work because that line of work is eliminated by the economy or because a new set of skills that you don't have is required to continue in that line of work and you have to go do something else. Well, the level of anger, anxiety in our society reflects how disorienting and dislocating the experience of thinking that you had a career that you were going to get good at and then having the rug pulled out from under you by technological change. And so the idea that it's not just the career path, the family structure, it's also skills and norms become outdated multiple times within a single generation. The rate of change is creating this sense of cultural churn and flux that is disorienting for many of us. The third dimension of this, the acceleration of the pace of life, and the idea that what Rosa calls action episodes. How long do you have to make a friendship, to acquire a skill, to develop a certain understanding? That these keep being compressed into shorter time frames. We try to do more things in less time. The result is we're very often multitasking, and the distinction between different kinds of social space is collapsing as a result. I like the example that the radio dramas of the 1920s and 1930s, before television was common, refused to accept commercial sponsorship and therefore generally didn't happen after 6 o'clock in the evening. And the sense was that that was family time. And because it was family time, it would be experienced as an intrusion into the intimate space of the domicile of the home to do something commercial. So we'll just play music or news at those periods and not try to do something commercial and intrusive, a clear sense. And I'll just note, right? These devices go everywhere with us. And as a result, they constantly tether us to electronic communication, and the norms around when electronic communication have completely broken down. I was thinking about this as I got an email from my dean at 11:30 p.m. the other night. And I'm not saying that she intended for me to respond at 11:30 p.m., but I am saying, right, if she had to phone me, if she had to call me on a landline that rang in my house, the likelihood that she would have done that at 11:30 p.m., the likelihood that she would have been up and working on college business at 11:30 p.m., right? That the idea that this is just a different world where we no longer believe that there are barriers, that there are timeframes that limit our accountability for professional tasks is one of the metrics of the acceleration of the pace of our lives. And then the idea that these three dimensions of acceleration are not distinct from each other, they actually reinforce each other, that technological change drives social change, that faster social change makes us feel we are falling behind, which forces us to increase our pace of life. And as we increase our pace of life, we demand new technology to relieve ourselves of various duties. Let me just for a moment talk about Amazon in this regard. And as I've said to you, I struggle with the use of Amazon. On the one hand, I do not like their labor practices. I do not like the behavior of Jeff Bezos in many regards. And so I don't like using a service that enriches him. And yet, my goodness, it sure as hell is convenient to be able to push a button on your computer screen, and the next day, the thing that you need is on your doorstep. And the alternative, of course, is that I have to go out into the world, which is not convenient, is not easy. It's not something that I feel that I have the time to do. And so the idea that maybe Amazon is actually increasingly indispensable because our lives are built in a way that doesn't leave the time for what we used to do. I think about the times I've lived in Europe, and when you had not a big grocery store, but a baker and a butcher and a cheese shop and a dessert shop and a brewer, and you went to each of those places and you got the thing that you needed, and there was something both, wonderfully artisanal about that economy, but also kind of relaxed about that pace of life. It's just not available to us anymore. And so the idea that we rely on these convenient technologies because it's almost structurally necessary to do so, yet they continue accelerating. So my metaphor here might be the hamster wheel that keeps going faster, the treadmill. But Rosa has, I think, a good metaphor as well, which is that we're walking up the down escalator. Right. And if you've ever tried to do that, I have, it's not easy. You got to move fast. And anytime you stop, backwards you go, right? And so that sense that we are in a world in which acceleration demands on our time, a scarcity or poverty of time are central experiences that it's driven by the rate of technological change, and we feel increasingly out of control of this. I think that's a very valuable insight as we stand on the cusp of yet another major technological breakthrough. So that's the setup for what I hope to continue discussing with you in the weeks to come. And we can, I hope, pick up together there next week. I'll stop now to ask you guys for your thoughts, questions, comments, objections. What do you think? Ring true? Are you a little insulated from all of this at this point? Sandy, go ahead.
This is a wonderful concept, and it really helps me understand what I went through as head of school. When I began, there were no computers. And then the teachers were expected to respond to parents immediately. And I used to talk to parents about, please don't email, don't text the teachers. It takes from their planning time. And I wish I had had this concept that I could have talked to the parents about this. This is terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course, and it's I do my best, not in a technical way, but to introduce you to some of the stuff I'm reading that I think is, a big idea and a helpful idea for analyzing stuff going on in our world. Yeah, so thank you for that, Sandy. Yeah, Wilma, go ahead.
We at Piedmont Gardens, we get to step off the moving sidewalk. And I think it's one of the delights and pleasures and benefits of being here, that we don't have to engage in that manner with the world around us. And maybe that's a bad thing, but I don't see it as a bad thing at my age. I don't want to go mano a mano.
Yeah, thank you for that, Wilma. And I've been thinking about this. The the generation before me at a certain level of success, people got country homes, right? You remember this idea, right? And particularly, yeah, where I am in New York, maybe it was a place in Maine or Vermont, or maybe it was a place on Long Island, Martha's Vineyard, etc. Right? You know, these places we're familiar with, where in a sense people went to be sheltered from the demands of the work week. And you're, I think, you know, as people who are mainly retired, and in a different phase in your life, in a sense, surrounded in that way. But the idea that there was a place in the country that you went to where everybody was at leisure, I think it's a really interesting idea. And I just wonder, I don't hear as much about this generation. It may be because it's just become such a luxury good. It's so expensive that I don't know the people who are doing it. But I do also think it might just be harder to maintain that sense of, I'm going to the country for the weekend. Well, of course, everything's going to follow you there because it's all electronic. So why bother, right? And maybe you don't have the time to do it anymore anyway. So yes, I like the idea of pointing to a space as a space of sheltering from the onslaught of the moving sidewalk. Thank you for that, Wilma. And anybody else before we call it a day? All right. So be well. And I'm glad you found this. It sounds like interesting and productive, and we will continue because there's certainly more to talk about here. Take care, everyone. Have good weeks. Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, guys.